So I see that there have been a number of new questions in the chat. And well, the last part of this seminar was really meant for questions. So in the interest of time, actually suggest that we launch into the panel discussion directly. And as I mentioned earlier, there were a number of remaining questions that have been asked during Christina Hepner's presentation before the break. So perhaps could I ask Christina to join us again? And of course, Katrina Fennell is of course very welcome to chime in as well, if she is still in the session. I shall just have a quick look at some of the questions that have been typed in. I see that there's, well, firstly, a question about time management. Of course, the lack of time is often mentioned as an important reason why researchers sometimes don't make their research reproducible. There was a suggestion from the audience. I'm not sure if I fully understand or if I can represent the suggestion correctly. It's labeled here as an alternative universe question. I think there was a response. This is the suggestion that researchers should use 20% of their time for making their work reproducible. So the question is, can we really afford this? Do we want 100% of our researchers to spend 2% of their time to this, or 5% of researchers spending 20% of their time? But perhaps a more general question is, what advice can you give to researchers who say that making research reproducible simply costs too much time?
Yes, thank you. I can really understand that it's intimidating to see and very confronting this time aspect. And I just want to repeat what I said, that indeed it took us, estimated it to be around actually 20% of the whole project's time. But that was for the first time. So it really, when you get used to these practices and you sort of, okay, which license do I need to pick for this type of code? Which software should I use? And it will dramatically reduce that time. So then I talked more about the 5%. And I think that is a more realistic figure for when you sort of got used to these practices. So I really think that as a current researcher, if you want to dive into this, you need to be aware of this sort of step you need to take. It will a lot of effort in the beginning, but you will be rewarded. Also see what is the support that you can get from your faculty. And that's different, of course, all around the world. What sort of support that you can get. And of course, when you apply for funding, put this in, right? I mean, that this is actually a real thing that you can budget for, and more funders allow you to as well. And it's of course, it will require also a more of a structural change in terms of the skills that we will build up. I mean, we need to start with our earlier students, that they need to build up these things from much an earlier age and so forth. So it will take time. I hope those.
I just want to add, I had a conversation just yesterday with a colleague of mine who's remarkably, almost intimidatingly productive about, how does she do her work? And she is just one of the most organized people that I have ever known. And she was saying, I only work 35 hours a week, which is, I think often at our university, people end up working more like 45. There's a lot of time creep in the American working system. And I think that the kinds of organizational practices that lead to reproducibility, if you start that way, right? It's sort of like if you keep your kitchen clean, you have everywhere, you already know where everything goes in the kitchen. You actually end up spending less time if you just put everything away right as you use it. So I think the ideal would be to, in fact, increase your productivity by having, when you begin the next project, all of that, right? Everyone is going to be no less in the future, including you, right? When you go back and say, oh, now I've been asked to do a follow-up to this project, I have to bring the next grant on, it's all right there and right to hand. I find this very challenging myself, but I think that it's true, and I see it in colleagues who are very organized.
Yeah, so being disciplined, being organized, being consistent is probably very important. That's probably going to save you some time. There's another question about data privacy. Of course, data often contain values about existing people, or values that can be traced to specific individuals. And there's a more general question related to this. How do we deal with privacy issues, and to what extent do you think the GDPR and increased privacy laws and regulations can hinder open science, at least in fields working with human data? Do you have any thoughts on this?
On that also from the ethical perspective, because I mean, of course, GDPR and HIPAA, make these things maybe in the forefront of people's minds, but I work with data protection lawyers a lot, and I'm not a lawyer whatsoever, but most of the time it correlates very closely with, well, how would you feel about it if it was your data or your children's medical data, or how would you want your data to be treated, and so I think it's not just a legal question, it's a core ethical question.
Yeah.
And we definitely see in medicine, we definitely see a difference in attitudes to sharing data. And I think, well, not only in medicine, of course, also can be in social science research and other research. I think it's something that should be taken very seriously, because fully de-identifying data is not the least bit trivial. It's actually really hard. And we see, probably we try very, very rarely that Elsevier will really remove an article that's been published, like really remove it, where we don't put a retracted banner across the text, but actually remove it. And it's usually for a privacy issue, right? And some cases it's completely genuine. You would not have thought necessarily that people could be identified. Sometimes it's cumulative data, but you get into these subcategories of subcategories, where it's this one clinic in this obscure rural part of Australia, where it's a very small place and there's only a few people, and actually without naming any names or mention anything around details, you could pretty much figure out who the people are, so I don't think it's a small thing. It has to be taken really seriously, is how you fully de-identify data, but also think about, well, there can be something in the middle, right, between sharing, really granular detail on a patient level that could risk identifying people, and not sharing anything, almost, right, or only sharing a very, very meta level that you see in an article, in a journal article.
Yeah, or anonymized data, perhaps.
Well, I think that's the problem. Anonymizing data it's not a simple thing at all. I mean,
no.
We often see examples where people truly believe they have anonymized it, and the editors and reviewers also would have seen it as anonymous. And it could only be sometimes a few people with really local knowledge who could de-identify, but that's enough, right? That's already inappropriate. Gabriella's you're on mute, Gabriella.
I'm so sorry. I'm just, the baby's making a lot of noise in the background, so I was telling her to pipe down. Please excuse me.
Maybe I can comment also very briefly to that, that we, when we talk to researchers about sharing data, we try to sort of switch the mindset into like, what can you actually share? So even if you can't share the actual raw data or even pseudonymized data, maybe you can still share the metadata. And that is, in the long run, a lot of data is let's be frank, 10-year-old data might not be usable anyway, right? For many reasons. So, but the metadata that really tells you about what the data is about and how the study was done, at least if you share that, that is definitely a big step into the open science direction. And yeah, can you maybe share some mock data that you had to at least help to reproduce the findings, or really try to not think I can't share because it's private, right? But okay, is there something that I could share? So, and of course, many universities have access to like privacy officers or people that help with these things and make use of these support people. They are there to help you.
Yeah, thank you. That sounds like a very productive approach. I think that's really helpful. There was a specific question for you, I think, Christina. So there's a question, are there examples of universities which make reproducibility workshops part of existing curricula, or are there any plans to implement repro hacks in formal education? So in social science research master programs, for example. Do you know of such examples? Or do you think it could be desirable to include these types of workshops in existing curricula?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I saw it and I started thinking about it. It's quite a new phenomenon. So it's I don't know any universities that have already implemented it in their curricula, but I think it would be very useful. And I've been also thinking about just at research groups, at the departments, just to make it as a regular event between PhD students, for example, for them to review their own or other papers, or things that are in the making. Also ideas for that. So yeah, I definitely encourage that, but I don't know if of any at the moment.
Yeah, it would certainly be a very interesting possibility, I think. There was also a question specifically to Gabrielle Hayden. I don't know if the baby already allows you to answer.
She's great. I just if there's a little noise in the background, you all know what's coming. So apologies for that.
So the question was that the technical possibilities are quite impressive, and I agree. So does it make for all researchers who code the analyses, if data, I'm not sure if I understand this question, also develop these skills? Or would dedicated personnel at institutes be a better solution? Yeah, so do researchers need to code all of these analyses themselves, or do we need dedicated people working on the technology?
I mean, I think
so leaving this open for everybody to figure out would leave a heterogeneous workflow, which is almost by definition suboptimal.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really excellent question. I mean, one important element is to think about, what are your resources? So at my library, we do offer consultations with researchers that can get pretty in-depth. But also, again, with what Christina mentioned about, really building this into your grant process. So thinking about, building in money for consultations that are, if those resources aren't available. Big labs, I work with I have big labs where there's either a data manager or a software engineer who is the specialist in the lab. So that's wonderful if you are a big lab, if you have that kind of money. But then I also think that, just having kind of established best practices within fields is going to, cut down a little bit on that heterogeneity. I mean, unfortunately, as with everything else, these are resource problems. And so, the question that Ben asks is really on point. Thank you.
Yeah. So I guess it also shows that the work that you do, education, organizing workshops, spreading the word about best practices is really important. Also to harmonize all the practices that exist. And there was another question about, related to your demonstration of replication with Docker images. Scroll down a little, apologies for this. So Docker images are huge. If I don't save the entire Docker image, how can I rely on availability of the parts in the future? So is the Docker file really sufficient?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, I think the answer is the Docker file is not sufficient because, you know, again, Docker is a company that makes no commitment to maintaining archival images or versions. I think an exception to this is something like the Rocker files that I use. They are committed to keeping archival versions and versioned versions, right? So it says this is the exact version of all of their files. So I think you could count on having access to those and having a Docker file that built levels on top of those particular ones. But I think, you know, often there is this recommendation to archive the entire Docker file. At the same time, you're still, in either case, depending on the software of Docker to be maintained and be accessible, right? And that can be a challenge. So one of the technologies that I didn't get to talk about, but that was really called out in the Nature essay was something called new GUIX, G-U-I-X, which they called possibly a new gold standard that's kind of trying to address some of that by pulling from things that are archived in software heritage and committing to a really archival containerized, they're using the container in a slightly different technical sense, but operating system. So, but I think that the person who asked that question really gets at the limits of Docker for reproducibility. Yeah, it's a big problem that we don't know. We haven't solved it. Yeah.
Thank you. There was another comment from somebody from the Leiden University Medical Center related to the topic that we talked about earlier about revising the curriculum. So they are contemplating the organization of ReproHacks, but they assume that it may be a step too far for medical students and that it's perhaps better for master students who focus 100% on science. Would you agree with that, Christina?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I think indeed, if you are aiming more towards, yeah, I mean, it's really for aiming towards science, indeed, to be able to reproduce things, but, and you can, I mean, we've been focusing on like hacking, so really papers with code, but you can also think about how would you do that for a paper in a different kind of field? What sort of things would you like to ask them? So yeah, I mean, you can also think out of the box in that sense, I guess.
Yeah.
I think it's always a good thing to teach students about reproducibility.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. I see that, yeah, no, it's okay.
Yeah, I think I was able at this point to move through most of the questions. I think that's also good timing because it's almost 5 o'clock here in the Netherlands, at least. So I think we need to conclude the panel and also the session today. So first of all, I'd really like to thank our panelists, our speakers today for your time today. So we're now approaching the end of the seminar, and since this was also the third and the final session that we had scheduled, where we will also conclude this whole seminar series of seminars in a few minutes. I would just like to say that I really hope that you have all find these seminars interesting and useful. It has really been our aim to raise awareness of the importance of reproducibility in research and to emphasize that reproducibility actually underpins the integrity of academic research, and it enhances the accountability of researchers. So ultimately, our collective knowledge can only grow if researchers can actually trust the results and the findings of their colleagues. So if they can steadily stand on the shoulders of giants. And of course, reproducibility is also altruistic. So it really means that you let other people reuse your materials. So in these seminars, we've done our best to approach this topic of reproducibility from different perspectives. So we focused on the rationale. We discussed the phenomenon at a more conceptual level. And particularly today, we concentrated on the practicalities and on the concrete steps that researchers can follow to improve the replicability of this research. So I hope that this diversified approach actually helps you to develop a more critical understanding of all the various issues. Now, at the close of this seminar, I would just like to take this opportunity to thank all my co-organizers. So Lauren Seesink, Christina Hetne, Kurt de Belder, Casper van Ommen, Erik Weber and Guus Jansen from Leiden University Libraries, but also Michiel Koolman and Sharon Duurmeijer from Elsevier. And organizing these seminars has actually been a real pleasure. Again, my gratitude towards our speakers today. Of course, also many thanks to all the people who registered and who attended. So thank you very much for your interest in your topic, also for all your questions and your comments. And I think I shall be rereading the chat archive with great interest today. So as I mentioned earlier, we'll all receive a mail with the link to all the recordings shortly. But if you have remaining questions or comments about these seminars, you can also contact us at cds@cdslibrary.leiden.nl. And also feel free to tweet about these lectures and to share your thoughts about these seminars using the hashtag reproducible research. And I do hope that we can continue this important discussion in some way or another beyond this series of seminars. But right now, I think there's little left for me to say, I think. So at this point, I shall just end the seminar. So thank you all very much and goodbye.